Ooh. Alright, friends. Let's begin with the second video in the series on the Gaming Gate. So I'm gonna try and avoid mentioning the people involved in GG specifically, just because there's so many grifters. You have the right-wing grifters like Milo, the left-wing grifters like Sarkeesian, and Wu and all of those people. I'm not really going to talk about them or reference their story, just because these people were just clearly grifting off the tragedy. They don't really add anything to it besides some personal objective e-celeb bull. And as an aspiring e-celeb cringe lord, I understand fully why they were involved in this, but I'm personally not going to put my thoughts and opinions out there. I have a very small channel with a very small audience, and I would like to keep it that way. So just to be sure, beyond calling out Zoe for being a slore, which was the entire point of everything, that's going to be the pretty much total mentions of all of the grifters associated with this. But just to note, there were a bunch of grifters floating around, collecting their donations, starting their e-careers, trying to be big boys. And Godspeed to them, right? But it is what it are. Anyways, but now it's on to the consequences of Gamergate and why it failed. So last episode we covered the timeline. If you didn't, or if this is your first episode, you're just tuning in for the first time really fast, Gamergate was basically Zoe Quinn cheated on her boyfriend with a bunch of people to try and promote a video game. He broke up with her, wrote an angry rant. 4chan and later 8chan and then Reddit got in cahoots and started playing the Doxy Boys and having a little fun, doing a little bit of trolling to try and get these people out of their spaces. And, coincidentally, they failed. Gaming died because these people associated with it killed it. And so why did gaming die, and why did this... So we're getting to the issue of why video gaming died, but that's for future episodes. Now we're going to go into why Gamergate failed. And Gamergate failed because the people associated with Gamergate and the people who were participating in it had some misunderstandings about the world. And these aren't misunderstandings I blame these people for. Who knew back in the day how bad things had really gotten? Oh, as an aside real quick, before we begin, I am burning incense. Right now, I am burning... which one is this? Kyonshiki. Autumn Leaves. Kyonshiki. So, this is a Japanese-style incense with a cute little burner. Big fan. Definitely should get yourself some if you like it. I love the smell as we approach autumn. So, the false assumptions these people had who were involved in Gamergate, what were they? So for one, they assumed we lived in a level playing field. They assumed things were equal. They assumed men and women would be held accountable for their actions. They were wrong, and who knew at that point in time how wrong they were? But the reality of the situation is, for at least the past 2 decades, we have lived in a matriarchy where women are immune from consequences, are immune from the failures of the decisions. And the government is going to use the power of government to protect the women regardless of who is right or wrong. And I would say that we've probably been living in a full-scale matriarchy since the sexual revolution, so probably the last 60 years, but it only really hit us in the gaming sphere in the last 20-ish. Right? Specifically in the last 10, it's really become quite the issue, but gaming is dead now. It's done. It's over with. Maybe there'll be a renaissance. I don't know. It's not looking good. But the reality is, it does not matter who is right or wrong in a lot of these cultural fights. The government and the powers that be are going to take the side of the women always. You could have divined that if you were, capable of legendary insight and looked at the family court. If you cast your mind into the family courts, into society, into the legal ways the government handles things, at that point in time, maybe you could have divined the fact that, it doesn't matter if you're morally correct, if, using your body to try and get positive reviews for a video game and having people go along with it is objectively wrong, and would lead to a state gaming is currently in where you can't trust gaming reviews currently, where the actual review from the critics is so different from the review from the fans that sometimes it can almost take up a full 10 points of difference, like polar opposites. Like, you're more realistically going to figure out if you're going to like a video game or not by looking at the horoscopes, or in this case, you look at the politics behind the people who made the game or what's involved with the game, and just play what's politically convenient to you. Spoilers, that's probably a much better way of defining which video games you want to play these days than actually reading a review, as sad as that might say. So, the biggest mistake Gamergate people made was they were under the mistaken 1950s era Americana ideal, where everyone is created equal and people are treated equally under the law. That idea is long gone. White men are going to suffer the highest amount of punishment for any crime, period. They are going to suffer the highest enforcement of that crime, and they are going to suffer hardest for it. And women are going to suffer the least for any of the crimes they commit, period. Judges and the juries are going to let women off more often than men. They're going to ignore women's crimes more often than men's crimes. And family court, for instance, is just going to default on the woman's side. So, as far as the legal precedent goes, we live in a world that is completely anti-male. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. We live in a hypergamous society. We live in misandry. We live in the exact opposite of a patriarchy since the sexual revolution. We live in a matriarchy, except in a matriarchy, women are not held accountable to their standards, so the equalities are even greater. And women, of course, rejoice at this. They rejoice at using their power to destroy organizations in male-only spaces, which is what they've done for the past 80 years, or 60 years, wantonly. And video games were one of the last refuges for male spaces, and they destroyed it, at least here in the West. There still are escapes. You can still get away, you can still put this all behind. So, Gamergate was a protest, in case you don't understand. And it was a protest against people who were using the legal system and using their bodies and using social credit to try and influence opinions and create social dissidence and destroy the world. Much like King Obama, much like the rape ape themselves, they were choosing to try and create a society that was flawed in nature. Sip, sip, sip. So, that was the biggest false assumption of Gamergate. The second biggest false assumption of Gamergate was that you or your opinions mattered. So, spoilers, if you're a white person, you're not allowed to have a voice in modern America. It has been that way for well over a decade. We, again, just didn't know because the government has these Fox voices up, has these fake voices up, but really, it's all just controlled opposition. We didn't understand at the time what fifth generational warfare was, or the kind of psyops that were going on and being used against the American people. The FBI and the United States government has been using the American people as test subjects for new warfare types and new different ways to manipulate populations. They've been using these successfully in other countries, and then they turned them to the United States to do a test on a first world nation. And they've succeeded. So in reality, there has been a war long before Gamergate even went on, and Gamergate was just seen as the first real attack against this system. But, who knows how much of Gamergate was actually controlled opposition? Who knows how much of it was, just grifting? And at the end of the day, who really knows how much, even behind a good and correct message, who just knows how much bull was actually associated with it? But it was actually preventing it from succeeding. And so you can say, well, certainly at least the purity of our ideals and, the correctness of them might stand on its own 2 feet. But we live in a society where being correct doesn't matter anymore. We didn't realize it at the time, but, men can be women apparently. Up is down, west is right. 1984 is, no longer in the nonfiction section, right? Or no longer in the fiction section. It's moved to nonfiction. It's reality. And so, given the fact that we live in a communist, matriarchy-run hellhole, there's different forms of protest are going to be necessary than what would have been used in the past. McCarthyism doesn't work in a sexual, liberal society in the post-sexual revolution. It's just not a viable mechanism. especially when the government's going to use its power and its violence, because the government is the supreme arbiter of violence, against you, not because you're right or wrong, but because you're a white male. Because you are a male and you enjoy video games, the government will use violence against you. That is their prerogative. Gamergate, as itself, was a crux and an institute and an expression of the state's violence against individuals, more so than anything else, in protection of women, in protection of this matriarchy, in protection of this pseudo-intellectual garbage. That's the reality of what Gamergate was. So trying to say otherwise, we come into all sorts of issues. And when you analyze the situation like that, you see why this protest did not matter. Because the women who got the death threats, they're just going to appeal to a higher form of violence to protect them. And that violence will, of course, protect them from their own horrible opinions, because consequences for speech only exist for white men. They don't exist for minorities. You know, Shaniqua Latikwa Queen BLM can walk around wearing a White Lives Don't Matter shirt, but God forbid you so much as say White Lives Matter in any of your videos or publications, just to give you an idea about this dichotomy and the way it applies. And again, you port it backwards into time into Gamergate, and it makes perfect sense why, even being fully correct, even pointing out the hypocrisy of everything, it does not matter. And the institutions will continue to churn on, honking their clown horns as they dance to the beat of the US government. And all the places are going to close these spaces where you're organizing this protest, and they'll eventually suffocate you out, which is what happened. Because that's the way the government deals with protests, through violence, through censorship, and through oppression. Just look at January 6th to see more examples of this. Just look at Ashley Babbitt to see, the government will kill even females that have the wrong opinions, but they're mostly going to smother and protest the men. So given those two realities, it almost seems like the battle was unwinnable from the start, which it was. No matter what Gamergate did, it would not have been able to win this battle and correct the industry and correct the timeline. Period. Which is in the wrong form of protest, because the people protesting are powerless in society, and it's the elites that are punching down on protesters to make society that way. So, what method, and some of you might ask, well, okay, what methods could you have used to protest in that scenario, and had it been successful? And really, the only way you can protest against a society in this state of decay like we are would be to look towards societies in decay that have, been collapsing in the ways people escaped out from under them. Now, there's the American Revolution style, which isn't applicable here because violence is not going to work in modern day. The state has such a monopoly on violence in these days, it can wipe out the entire planet. There is no amount of violence that you and I can muster to win. There is an alternative way that we can win, though. If you look at like a Gandhi-type scenario, you can protest by doing nothing. You can starve the government back of resources, and that's what would have worked in a Gamergate-type scenario. If that mass of people had backed away from video games, had backed away from society in general, had stopped contributing to a system that hated them, then they could have brought it down by themselves. And they still can, and probably a large part of the Gamergate movement is a large part of those people that say there's 7 million unemployed men not working. There's probably a connection there, and that number needs to grow and needs to improve if we're going to bring down the system, if we're going to reset the scales of this country. But that also means the destruction of Judeo-Christian values, of the previous matriarchy, of everything else. And that's unavoidable because it's been too far corrupted. So the actual way Gamergate can win this scenario is not to dox and harass people. It's not to use McCarthyism or active forms of protesting. It's to use Gandhi or passive forms of protesting. That is the only way in fifth generation warfare for people to bring down the system. Stop contributing to society. Stop doing anything to aid this corrupt society. Stop paying taxes to pedophiles that are going to put in laws where Shaniqua can lie about you giving her a bad look and you're owed 50 years of child support randomly off her and her babies, or whatever bullshit reasons they're going to put up. Like, think about it this way, to drive this point home about why this movement failed and why video games failed. Outside of the court here in New York, the family court in New York, is a statue of Medusa holding Pisces' head in her hand. The hero that's supposed to slay her in mythological Greek, she beheads him in a complete opposite of what's supposed to happen as far as the Judeo-Christian, or the Greek in this case fairy tale, or the dragon, the hero's quest, hero slays the dragon sort of ordeal. The exact opposite is true. Why would you have a statue like that outside of a family court if you weren't broadcasting your intention? It does not matter what you do as far as peaceful protest goes, as far as working against the system. Nothing you do is going to change anything about anything. The only thing you can do is starve the system of your resources, let it sputter out, let the people behind that system suffer, and then let everything collapse. And that's exactly true of video games, where we need to back away from modern video games, AA titles, and start moving away and divesting our attention into either the East or mini video games, and starve that system, starve the and the problem is that it's not just video games. You can't just correct the video games. You pull out money from the video games, BlackRock or the US government's just going to subsidize your entertainment, right? It's not going to matter in the grand scheme of things. What matters is you have to deprive BlackRock and the government of your resources. So, going forwards, if you want to make a movement that can succeed, that can actually affect change, we need a movement that deprives not just the thing we're trying to destroy, but the entire society as a whole, because the entire society as a whole is anti-white male, is anti-you, and does not care what your thoughts and opinions are. You do not have free speech. You do not have freedom of assembly as a white person anymore. You don't have right to a Fourth Amendment. You don't have the right against unranked search and seizures. You don't have the right to point out hypocrisy about anyone else. You have no free speech. Whatever you say and do does not matter, because the people with the guns are going to shoot you if you question them. Like these grifter females that had been quote-unquote death threats, ooh, spooky, on the internet. They had police officers around them constantly that would just randomly arrest people, so much as that would dare to even question them. And that was just questioning them, because it was a complete violation of First Amendment. But who cares, right? You're not allowed to question people. You're not allowed freedom of association. The government will put its boot on your neck if you try. So in reality, that is why Gamergate failed, because they didn't understand the extent of what was happening during the events. And in the next episode, we're actually going to cover the consequences of that failure, and the consequences of it understanding, and what happened to gaming and why it died. Peace.